Victor Cuck? Victor, apologies if I got that wrong. I'm sure I must have. Here's one. I just love these because they're so in the weeds. He asked, do you think that prop-driven aviation has reached its limit, or do you think that it could have evolved further if the jet engine had not been developed? The problem is not the propeller, Victor. The problem is the internal combustion engine. That's the problem as far as aviation is concerned. And I could do all night on this, but I honestly won't. I want to keep moving. But just the short form is this. If somebody had invented the jet engine before the internal combustion engine, and somebody brought you the internal combustion engine, you'd laugh them out of the room. A jet engine essentially has one moving part. It's basically a shell down which the center of which is a spinning axis, and on that axis are a series of very small blades that compress air on the way in, and then as the hot exhaust goes out, it's actually spinning that the way you'd hold a pinwheel outside of a car window and have it spin real fast. And that's what keeps the whole cycle going. It's essentially one moving part, and that's why jet engines are so unbelievably reliable. Coots. Sorry about that, guys. Because there's only one part to fail, and that part doesn't just give up the ghost. You know, if you've got a problem with a bearing, you usually get a fair amount of warning on this. So we call it a jet engine. My Uncle Ted, who's lectured on jet engines since he's an engineer, and he's been lecturing 20-year-old Asian engineering students for 60 years now. And he basically never refers to them as jet engines. He calls them what they probably really should be called, and that's a gas turbine engine. So the jet engine, the gas turbine engine, one moving part. Now, an internal combustion engine, let's just look at one cylinder, because my airplane has 4 cylinders, and there were airplanes in the final days of propeller-driven aviation, which really means internal combustion aviation, because it's not the propeller. Some of these, like the Wright Cyclone, I want to say had 28 cylinders. I want to say something like that. Somebody's going to let me know. But think about this. In order for my 4-cylinder internal combustion engine to generate power, what has to happen is a very solid piece of steel has to rotate, and as it rotates, it lifts up this steel arm, which is connected in one direction to this giant metal can. And this thing has to be lubricated with a very fine layer of oil. The tolerances have to be almost perfect. If it's too thick, it won't move. If it's too thin, the force goes around it. And this can called this piston has to come right to the top of this solid, very heavy metal chamber. And as it's coming up, it's taking fuel and air and compressing them, which is what the gas turbine does. It compresses air and then ignites it. But in an internal combustion engine, it doesn't just smoothly go through the engine, and the engine just does nothing but spin. That's why jets are so smooth. When the first German pilots were flying the Me-262, the first operational jet aircraft, they were saying it feels like we're being pushed along by angels because it's so smooth. Back to the internal combustion engine. You got this big hunk of metal going into this tiny exposed space. A valve closes, a spark fires. There's an explosion, because that's exactly what it is. And the force of the explosion puts pressure on all sides of the cylinder, but the only side of the cylinder that can actually move, because it's big hunk and piece of metal, is this piston, and that thing just is blown down. And as it blows down, that back and forth linear motion has to be converted into circular motion, because your propeller has to go around. Your propeller can't just go back and forth. And you lose a lot of the energy converting it from downward motion onto this kind of a cam. There's a better word for it, but I don't remember what it is. And so you've got this bang, bang, and you're trying to turn that into circular motion. It's actually more complex than that, because you don't get that power every single time. You get it every other time. So just to reiterate, for those of you who may have not had the engineering classes that I didn't have either, here's how the modern internal combustion engine works, essentially. All of them, certainly my airplane engine, is like this. There's a piston inside a cylinder, and there are 2 valves at the top. One is the intake valve, which leads to the air and the fuel, which has already been mixed. Or in the case of a fuel-injected engine, it's just the air. And the other valve is the exhaust valve. So first thing that happens is the piston comes up. There's the valves are closed and it's filled with fuel, it fires, knocks the piston down. And as the piston comes back up again as a result of the other pistons that are moving out of sequence with this one, the exhaust valve opens and all of that burnt fuel, all of that smoke basically, as it comes up, is just blown out through the exhaust port. Now, you're not getting a spark again. See, this is a dead cycle. You're not making any energy on this cycle. So the other pistons are still moving, and that takes this piston down again. The exhaust valve closes. The intake valve opens, and now, as the piston's going down, it's sucking. It's just blown out all of the crap, the burned smoke and everything. And now it's pulling in a fresh charge of air and fuel. Now, if it's a carbureted engine, the air and the fuel have already been mixed in the carburetor. If it's a fuel-injected engine, it puts a little squirt of fuel in there. But in any event, it pulls down the fresh fuel-air mixture, and then that valve closes. And then the piston comes up again, and it compresses this fuel and air, and then the spark goes off, and it fires. So that's a four-stroke engine, basically. Power stroke, exhaust stroke, intake stroke, power stroke, just like that. Now, just one cylinder means that in order for this thing to work, you have to have a cylinder. You have to have a piston. You have to have rings around the piston that seal the piston right up against the wall, because if there's gaps between the side of the piston and the cylinder, all of that explosive force will go around the piston. You lose a lot of power. So you've got to have these rings, and these rings are matched to incredibly fine tolerances. And this thing's got to slide up and down, and it's got to slide up and down very easily, so you got to have it bathed in oil. Constantly, every time the cylinder goes down to the bottom, it gets oil squirted on it, and this oil gets very, very hot. And if the oil gets too hot, it doesn't work anymore. The hotter oil gets, the less oily it becomes, the less viscous it becomes. So you've got that problem. And then you've got these valves on the top of these things, and these things are moving. If you ever watch an engine running, it's not like it's so those things have to be moving, and they have to be timed perfectly, because if you blow the timing on this just by a few degrees, if the spark fires a little too early or a little too late, your power essentially goes away. All of this stuff has to happen to make one cylinder work. So you've got gigantic hunks of iron going boom, boom, back and forth, 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 and valves are moving up and down, and cams are rotating, and it's just nuts. It's nuts. It's insane. And that's what we all fly on. And that's why I'm glad I'm a glider pilot. Now, with all of that said, the aircraft internal combustion engine is extremely reliable because it's as simple as it can be. The kind of engine that I have on my airplane might have powered a car in the 1940s, but since then, automobiles have gotten far, far, far more advanced. But in aviation, we like to keep things simple because reliability is the number one aspect of an airplane engine. Reliability is tops. And so we give up some efficiency for reliability. But even then, when I fly the piston engine that I'm flying in my Long Easy, I'm not so much a pilot as I'm a flight engineer. I mean, I have to be, at any given time, I have to worry about the mixture. How much fuel relative to how much air? I got to watch the RPMs. I got to watch the temperatures. I got to watch the coolant temperature, which cools down the oil. I got to watch the oil temperature. I have to watch the temperature of the cylinder heads, the parts that's actually taking the explosion and go down. I have to watch the temperature of the exhaust gas that's coming out. And all of these things I would watch like a hawk. I watch like a hawk. Now, there's some great engine monitors that will show you when you're, it's getting out of, but I'm checking it all the time. Because it's extremely unusual for an engine to just give up the ghost. It usually it's trying to tell you something. If your oil temperature continues to rise and rises out of the green arc, and the oil temperature keeps rising, you've got a problem. Probably the problem is that you're leaking oil, so the less oil is trying to take more heat away. And as the oil begins to diminish, it's less and less effective at taking the heat away. It gets hotter and hotter and hotter. If you see your oil temperature start to climb and keep climbing, then it is time to land the airplane immediately. And you can figure out all of these potential problems by looking at, at these gauges and so on. So the problem, Nathan, is not that the propeller, I'm sorry, it's not Nathan, it's Victor. The problem is not that we took propeller technology as far as it goes. The gigantic leap forward was not really from a propeller to a jet. The giant leap forward was from an internal combustion engine into a gas turbine engine. I think on the right Cyclone engine with 28 cylinders, I want to say there's something like 11,000 moving parts. No exaggeration. It's absolutely mind-boggling how complex it is, and not just moving. You're asking these things to do crazy things. Stop, start, stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. You know, burning hot, liquid cold, burning hot. You know, it's just nuts. It's nuts. Jet engine just goes ooh, compresses air on the front. Shh, fuel gets burned in there. Lit. Out the back end it goes ooh. They're so reliable. Now I would fly if I had a single engine jet. I would fly in places that I would never, ever, ever take my single engine internal combustion engine. And when I say take it places, I'm talking about both physical places, and I'm also talking about like operational places. You're looking at a boy here who will never, ever, ever fly an airplane over terrain that he can't land on without an engine. We all get that? You will never see me in an airplane over terrain that is not landable. If I have to go over mountains, I'm going to go so high over mountains that my incredibly efficient Long Easy will turn into a glider and glide me out of the mountains, and I will land somewhere else, or I will be over a freeway or something, but you will never see me in an airplane, in a piston airplane, over terrain that I cannot land on. And I just won't do it. And that means being low. Sometimes if you're over terrain and you're in a city, or not a city, but you've got people around you. But if you're so low that you can't glide to a landing, then I'm not going there. Now, if I had a jet engine on my plane, I would absolutely take that places where I would never dare take a single engine internal combustion engine, because the jet is so reliable. It's so simple. It's so reliable. It almost always gives you so much warning that something's going wrong, that you can fly a jet into places that I would never, ever, ever take an internal combustion engine, at least not a single combustion engine. Which leads us to two final points before we go, and you know how much I love this kind of stuff, Victor. First of all, as I said, it's not the propeller, it's the jet engine, the gas turbine engine. So what you'll often see when you look at these smaller commuter airlines that have propellers, people think, oh, that's old school, that's, it's old technology. It's not really. The propeller is more efficient than the jet in certain situations. So, bless your heart, Johnny Quest. How many more memberships do we need before Bill can afford a jet aircraft? Bless you. 4,000 is the answer. So, when you look at these commercial airplanes with the propellers, you're not looking at the kind of engine that powered a B-17 Flying Fortress, for example. It's completely different. When you see those things, what you really got is you've got a jet engine, you've got a gas turbine engine with all of the reliability of a regular jet engine, and it's just got a propeller stuck on the front of it. It's really pretty much that simple. So you've still got the efficiency, you've got the power, and especially the reliability of a jet engine, and it's just got a propeller in the front. And that's called a turboprop engine. Pure jet engine, all the air comes in at the front and goes out the back. If you're old enough to remember the early days of jet aviation, you will remember how unbelievably loud those engines were, and how unbelievably extra loud they were. They were astonishingly loud, and they made a very high-pitched whine, because all of the air on the original jet engines, look at a 707, for example, first successful commercial jet airliner, and you look at the engines, got 4 engines, because they're still learning about jets. They hadn't realized how incredibly safe they are. But you look at the jet engines on a 707 original model, and you'll find they're very long and thin. They're long and thin on a 727, and the original 737s, which is the ubiquitous airplane today, had very long, thin engines, almost like drinking straws right underneath the wings. Those were basically pure jet engines, and that meant that all the air in that engine goes into the engine, gets compressed, spark, out the back it goes. But I want to say in the early 70s, I think it was probably the 747, they figured out that this is not the most efficient way to do things. So what they figured out was, let's keep that whole thing. Everything we just talked about, we're going to keep that. But instead of putting a propeller on the front, we're going to put a fan on the front. In other words, we're going to put a propeller, but the propeller is going to have 40 blades on it. It's not going to look like a propeller, but it's pretty much exactly what it is. So now this jet engine, this gas turbine, is taking air in, and it's blowing the air out, and it's spinning this fan. But the fan is also moving air, and that air is not going into the jet engine at all. It's just moving air past it, just like a regular propeller is. And that does some really cool things. First of all, it means you get a lot more thrust. It means that the hot air that's coming out of the back of the jet engine, which is what generates so much of the noise, is in a shroud of cooler air that's been blown backwards by the fan. And for those of you out there who are talking about chemtrails, the difference between jet engines of 20, 30 years ago and today is that the volume of air that they move is enormous. Older jets moved a small volume of air very fast. The newer jets move a bigger volume of air much more slowly. And so the actual amount of contrail, the actual amount of air that can be frozen by ice crystals to form a contrail is orders of magnitude wider than it used to be. And that engine's called a turbofan. And turbofan engines are absolutely the most reliable thing in the world. You can fly from here to Australia on an airplane that has two engines. My fiance has flown from Moscow to Los Angeles direct on a 777 with two engines. Two. And that's because the chance of one engine failing is virtually nil, and the chance of them both mechanically failing is zero. Just the last thing for you out there who worry a little bit about flying, you cannot get into an airplane, commercial airplane certainly. You cannot get into an airplane that cannot survive a worst case failure of one of the two engines. So in other words, there is at no point, if you're going to fly from Los Angeles to New York, there is no point in that flight ever where you couldn't make it on one engine, because otherwise you just wouldn't want to, you'd need another engine. So a twin-engine airplane, if it's accelerating down the runway, and that's when the jet engine is working its hardest, that's when all the thrust is needed. And if you get this thing up to speed, and just as you start to rotate, and just as the aircraft is lifting off, this is when everything's working as hard as it can. It's moving slowly. Wings have a high angle of attack, a lot of drag. If one of the jet engine goes out like that, then the other engine has enough power to continue the climb, circle around, bring you back down, make a perfectly normal landing. You wouldn't even know it. That's something there. So anyway, that's what's so cool about aviation. And hey, kids, you can be part of this fun scene too. If you want to become a pilot, go out to your local airport and find a flight school and take a ride, because it's really cool. And not everybody can do this. And you'll be surrounded by people that you would like very much. You're going to be surrounded by people who are half bright anyway. I mean, I'm a genius, but my friend Foghorn here flies fighter jets, and he's basically as smart as maybe a very smart dog, like some kind of a shepherd, like an Australian shepherd or something. He can fly a jet engine. It's not that hard. Yeah, there you go. Lots of fun. Go do it. It's really cool. It's much, much better than flight sims because the view is amazing. And unlike a person who spends time on flight sims, when you get out of an actual airplane, you can walk around like you own the world because you are a steely-eyed missile man. And that's not something you get as an online bonus when you level up. Okay, moving on.